For thousands of years, various charlatans, frauds, and con men have used religion to deceive folks, manipulate folks, and exploit folks. And religion has functioned very well as a tool of deception and manipulation. But does that mean that religion was designed to deceive and manipulate folks? Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by Norm Geisler and Frank Turek. We've just finished Chapter 3 on the cosmological argument, which Geisler and Turek think may be the very strongest argument of all in apologetics. And they may be right. Even though it falls way far short of proving that there's a God, it still might be the best argument they got. But now we start in Chapter 4 on the argument from design. And maybe I'm reading into things, but I sort of has the impression that Geisler and Turek ain't as confident in this one. There's an old saying that the less you have to say, the longer it's going to take you to say it. And Geisler and Turek has padded the heck out of this chapter. It ain't enough for them to say that here's X, Y, and Z values that we need to survive, and therefore God must have designed X, Y, and Z. No. They have to bring in the script from the movie Apollo 13 to spice things up a bit. And I can certainly understand that. At its core, the argument from design is just a bald emotional appeal to primitive unreasoning superstition. You see something you don't understand, and instead of doing the research it would take to begin to understand it, you just immediately ascribe it to some magically invisible person. It's a cop-out. It's the same kind of reasoning that originally led folks to think the Earth was a flat disk at the center of the universe. It's what we do instead of trying to actually learn something we didn't know before. So it's no wonder that Geisler and Turek would bring in a Hollywood blockbuster to distract from the fundamental weakness of their argument. But anyways, they starts off with their usual bravado. Quote, "The astronomical evidence for God must be strong when atheistic physicists admit that the universe exploded out of nothingness and agnostic astronomers claim that supernatural forces were at work in the beginning." End quote. And needless to say, Geisler and Turek is way overstating their case here. And if you ask a physicist about it, they's going to be only too happy to correct Geisler and Turek's misuse of terms like exploded and nothingness. And also, who's these agnostic astronomers, plural, who now believe in the supernatural? As you will recall from Chapter 3, the complete list of agnostic astronomers, cited by Geisler and Turek as invoking supernatural, is as follows. Dr. Robert Jastrow, that's it. One astronomer trying to sell a book about his idiosyncratic post-Christian deism. Now, Dr. Jastrow may be many things, but plural ain't one of them. And that may seem like a trivial thing, but it's typical of how Christian stories improve with the telling. A lot of the more amazing details in the Gospels can be easily explained by simple, incremental embellishments over the decades that passed between the time the event supposedly occurred and the time the stories about them were first written down. All it takes is for ancient Christians to have been as willing as Geisler and Turek and other modern Christians to bend the truth just a little bit each time to make their stories a bit more compelling. But anyway, that's all review. Let's move on. Geisler and Turek introduce the subject of Chapter 4 by explaining that the argument from design is formally known as the teleological argument. Quote, "The teleological argument goes like this. Every design had a designer. The universe has highly complex design. Therefore, the universe had a designer." End quote. Now notice a couple things here. First, the subtle shift from designer with a lowercase d in premise 1 to designer with an uppercase D in the conclusion indicating God. This is a kind of sneaky bait and switch that's frequently used by apologists to smuggle their personal theology into arguments that's designed to look like simple, straightforward syllogisms. But more importantly, the argument from design, or teleological argument, assumes that we can easily and correctly identify design in what we see. And that ain't as easy as Geisler and Turek would like us to believe. To establish actual design, there's three things we need to establish. First and most obviously, we need to establish that the designer exists and is capable of producing the design. Ain't no point in attributing things to an imaginary designer or to a designer who couldn't have designed them, or at least couldn't have carried them out. Second, we need to establish that design is more likely to have produced the thing than any other process. That is to say, we need to establish that the design process would be more consistent with what we see in objective reality than other alternative processes, which of course means we need to be able to describe the design process itself in some detail. And lastly, we need to establish that the designer intended to produce whatever form or function constitutes the design. And that last one's important because it's possible for things to have unintended functions, whether they was designed or not. As the 9/11 terrorists so horrifically demonstrated, commercial airliners can function as weapons of mass destruction, even though the designers never had any intention of building that kind of a weapon. Intention is a necessary part of design, and if we can't show intention, then we can't show design. So let's look at the evidence that Geisler and Turek claim is proof that, quote, the universe has highly complex design, end quote. And let's see how well they do at meeting the three criteria that it takes to establish design. Their first example is the tired and long since debunked watchmaker analogy. Quote, imagine you're walking along in the woods and you find a diamond-studded Rolex on the ground. What do you conclude is the cause of that watch? The wind and the rain? Erosion? Of course not. There's absolutely no question in your mind that some intelligent being made that watch. End quote. So this will give us a good test run. Let's start with the first test. Does the designer exist and possess the capability of producing the design? Well, of course it does. Quick Google search turns up the Rolex Company, a Swiss designer and manufacturer of luxury watches, with a catalog of products, some of which look very similar to the watch we found in the woods. Test number 2. Is the design process more consistent with what we can reliably observe in objective reality than the possibility that watches are produced by wind, rain, and erosion? Indeed it is. We can watch YouTube videos showing the process by which Rolex watches are made, and we can also watch videos showing wind, rain, and erosion until we're satisfied that they don't seem to be showing any signs of producing Rolex watches. And lastly, did the designer intend to produce the watch? And once again, yes, this is easily verified by looking at the advertising materials produced by the Rolex marketing department. They deliberately manufacture watches so they can sell them. So yeah, so far so good. Our method works correctly when detecting design in things that was actually designed. But of course, the fact that people design watches don't prove that there's any kind of creator God out there. So Geisler and Turek has their work cut out for them still. They try to shoehorn their apologetics into the script for the movie Apollo 13, but we's going to skip over all the Hollywood scripting and special effects, a little under 2 pages worth, and go straight to the part that they claim shows divine design. Quote, oxygen level. On Earth, oxygen comprises 21% of the atmosphere. That precise figure is an anthropic constant that makes life on Earth possible. If oxygen was 25%, fires would erupt spontaneously. If it were 15%, human beings would suffocate. End quote. And fun fact, not only is the oxygen level not an anthropic constant, it ain't a constant at all. The level of oxygen in the atmosphere has varied widely over time and only reached significant levels in the atmosphere in the last billion years or so. Since the Cambrian period, atmospheric oxygen has sometimes been as low as 15%, and during the Carboniferous period it reached levels as high as 35%. What's more, as hardcore mountain climbers know, the effective oxygen level decreases the higher in elevation you climb. By the time you get to the top of Pikes Peak, it's only 12.3%, and at the top of Everest, it bottoms out at just under 7%. So no, oxygen levels ain't some kind of anthropic constant that demonstrates some kind of divine design. There's evidence of global biochemical processes that tend to achieve equilibrium for extended periods of time, leading biological organisms to adapt to the prevailing oxygen levels of the time. The oxygen level ain't designed to support humans, Humans is evolved to survive under conditions that include the current oxygen level at common elevations above sea level. And I don't think we even need to apply our 3 criteria for detecting design, because at this point, Geisler and Turek ain't even in the ballpark yet. So let's move on to their second so-called anthropic constant. Quote, atmospheric transparency. If the atmosphere were less transparent, not enough solar radiation would reach our surface. If it were more transparent, we would be bombarded with far too much solar radiation down here. End quote. And I'm scratching my head here, because even for Geisler and Turek, this one's amazingly lame. First of all, because once again, the amount of cloud cover has varied and continues to vary all the time. Locally, some areas get more solar radiation and others get less, depending on latitude and also depending on the weather, which is famous for continually changing. Plus, you occasionally get phenomena like supervolcano eruptions, releasing large amounts of sulfur dioxide and ash, which increase the cloud cover, followed by extended periods where there ain't enough solar radiation reaching the ground and crops fail and people die. Then there's the fact that what protects us from solar radiation ain't the transparency of the atmosphere, it's the ozone layer, which happens to be transparent, plus the Earth's magnetic field, which between the two of them managed to deflect most of the harmful radiation away from the Earth's surface. And lastly, there's the fact that the transparency of atmospheric gases is determined by the physical properties of the elements and molecules involved. There ain't no dial somewheres that you could twist to make nitrogen more or less transparent. It just is what it is. Plus, this one don't even have anything at all to do with Apollo 13, which makes it a really awkward tie-in to the script that they're trying to follow here. I think maybe they're trying to update a more classical apologetic and make it sound more modern and convincing, but they just failing miserably here. So let's look at the next one. Quote, Moon-Earth gravitational interaction. If the interaction were greater than it currently is, tidal effects on the ocean's atmosphere and rotational period would be too severe. If it were less, orbital changes would cause climatic instabilities. In either event, life on Earth would be impossible. End quote. And we's 3 for 3 so far in quoting constants that ain't constant. But you know what? I'm tired of pointing that out all the time. Let's look at this one from a slightly different angle. So first of all, notice how vague and hand-wavy this argument is. If it were greater than it currently is, well, how much greater? What would make it greater? If the moon were closer to the Earth? Okay, but it used to be closer to the Earth, and life did just fine. If it were less? How much less? It's slowly moving away from the Earth, so its gravitational interaction is indeed decreasing, but the effect on the climate is negligible. Greenhouse gas emissions have a much greater impact on climate instability, and we've already started seeing the effects. It seems like kind of a waste of time to fine-tune the orbit of the moon so as not to trigger negligible climate instabilities without bothering to fine-tune the greenhouse gases not to have a disproportionate and possibly catastrophic impact. All in all, it sounds like Geisler and Turek got a hold of some kind of pop-sci article about the gravitational effects of the moon and didn't understand it, and said, oh well, we can use this to claim that life would not exist on Earth unless the moon's orbit were fine-tuned. Which is horse apples, of course. The moon has the gravitational influence it does because of ordinary physics and orbital mechanics. And life adapted to that gravitational influence because it evolved under that influence. So, of course, life as we know it seems well adapted to conditions on a planet with a moon. Design ain't got nothing to do with it. Geisler and Turek's argument just boils down to, ooh, astronomy is cool, therefore God. I mean, that's literally as much intellectual content as they's presenting here. Okay, next one. Quote, carbon dioxide level. If the CO2 level were higher than it is now, a runaway greenhouse effect would develop. We'd all burn up. If the level were lower than it is now, plants would not be able to maintain efficient photosynthesis. We'd all suffocate. End quote. And that's right, folks. Once upon a time, even Christian apologists used to acknowledge the danger posed by rising levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases. But just like with oxygen levels, the carbon dioxide levels have varied throughout Earth's long geological history, and in recent years is rising alarmingly fast. Will Geisler and Turek acknowledge that this means CO2 levels ain't an anthropic constant and thus not evidence for design? I'll give you 3 guesses. Last one, at least for the Apollo 13 gimmick. Quote, gravity. If the gravitational force were altered by 1 times 10 to the negative 38%, our sun would not exist and therefore neither would we. End quote. And once again, Geisler and Turek cite a constant that ain't a constant. Gravitational force decreases with distance from the center of mass, which is why at a certain distance from a star or a planetary body, we can consider the force of gravity to be effectively 0. Now, it's possible, and maybe even likely, that Geisler and Turek misunderstood the science here and is actually talking about the gravitational constant, not gravitational force. And it's true that in certain formulations of string theory, it's theoretically possible to create local variations in the gravitational constant, although it would require extremely high amounts of energy to do so. And of course, even that's just a hypothesis and not anything that anybody's ever proven to be possible. As far as we know for sure, the gravitational constant is a constant, which means it don't change and it can't be tuned. And by the way, what's up with all them zeros in the original quote? I gotta confess that I'm highly suspicious that this is just more apologetics hand-waving, throwing out impressive, scary numbers that's designed to fool gullible people into believing that God must exist, which is probably the first actual design we've had in this chapter. And that's the end of Geisler and Turek's attempts to distract us with the script of Apollo 13, but it ain't the end of Chapter 4, and we'll get to the rest next time. Meanwhile, this is a good place for us to take a quick break and take stock of what we've seen so far. So far in this chapter, Geisler and Turek has tried to prove that the universe is designed by citing what they called 5 anthropic constants, of which 0 was actually constants, although one of them sounds like something else that actually is a constant, but still not a great foundation to build on. And if we hold their 5 so-called anthropic constants up to the 3-part test for whether or not something actually is design, we see that in none of the 5 cases did they even attempt to begin to demonstrate the existence of a designer capable of implementing that particular design. Nor did they ever document any kind of design process that was more consistent with what we can verifiably observe in objective reality than a physical origin would be. And lastly, in none of the 5 cases did they even attempt to document any stated intention on the part of the designer to implement any of the so-called anthropic constants that they claim was designed. And this highlights the main problem with the argument from design, which is that you have to assume the divine creator designed everything in order to find the supposed designs that you need to prove the existence of the divine creator. In other words, the argument from design necessarily assumes its conclusion before it even gets started. Before you can make an argument from design, you first have to prove the design, and in order to quote-unquote prove the design, you have to assume the designer, because otherwise all you got is complexity and function, and that's not the same thing. Apologists, of course, want us to conclude that something must be designed just because it's complex. They want us to assume that only design can produce complex function. But that simply ain't so. Complex functions is amazingly easy to create. Take the weather, for example. A while back, researchers tried to simulate weather patterns by tracking 3 variables: temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure. Only 3 variables. At each step in the simulation, a new temperature, pressure, and humidity would be calculated based on the previous temperature, pressure, and humidity, and each of those 3 variables influenced the other 2 in specific ways. Well, if you chart out a graph of the temperature and pressure and humidity, you get this amazingly complex pattern, very similar to the quote-unquote random changes we see in the real world, from only 3 variables, just doing simple arithmetic. And that's the key to understanding the world around us. When you get a large number of simple agents interacting and influencing the behavior of other simple agents, the result is functional complexity, without any intelligent oversight or design. And of course someone will say, well, that don't count because the simulation program was intelligently designed, which is true, but that don't matter because it weren't designed to produce complex graphs. All it was designed to do was calculate a new temperature based on simple arithmetic with the values for pressure and humidity, and a new value for humidity based on temperature and pressure, and a new value for pressure based on temperature and humidity, just using basic arithmetic. The functional complexity did not come from the design of the simulator. It came from the fact that when you have simple, real-world interactions where different factors influence each other, you get functional, unintentional, undesigned complexity. It's a fascinating topic, and if you'd like to learn more about it, just look up chaos theory and strange attractors and stuff like that. But the main point is that when we're surrounded by so much spontaneous, unintended functional complexity, it'd be foolish to assume that functional complexity can only be produced by design. But that's the mistake you have to make in order to buy into the argument from design. And I'm sure there's lots more that could be said, but that's going to do it for me for today. Next time, Geisler and Turek is going to focus specifically on what's called the fine-tuning argument based on old Earth creationism, and I'm sure we're going to have fun with that. Meantime, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.